We come together for a moment out of time in a place made holy by our presence, to celebrate what is deepest and most true, to honor the beauty of our own heart's longing, to cultivate wonder, imagination, and the courage to act, and to care for one another. Please light your chalice. Our common chalice is now lit.
Come, whoever you are, wanderer, worshiper, lover of leaving, ours is no caravan of despair. Come yet again, come. Come, come, whoever you are, wanderer, worshiper, lover of leaving, ours is no caravan of disbelieving, ours is no yet again of despair. Come yet again, whoever you are, wanderer, worshiper, lover of leaving, ours is no caravan, whoever is leaving, wanderer, worshiper, lover of leaving, ours is no caravan of despair. Come yet again, lover of leaving, ours is no caravan, whoever is leaving, ours is no caravan, whoever is leaving, ours is no caravan, of leaving, ours is no caravan of despair. Come yet again, come.
Welcome to worship with the Church of the Larger Fellowship. We're particularly happy to have you with us for this, the first week of October, as we begin to explore our monthly theme of vulnerability. It's kind of a tricky subject since vulnerability is both something to be pursued in the interests of openness and honesty and authenticity, but it's also something to be avoided, as when we talk about vulnerable populations or vulnerable people, even vulnerable species. So it's a good thing we have a whole month to get to it. We're particularly excited this week to welcome our new Learning Fellow, Jessica Starr-Rockers, as she offers her first homily with us. That's its own kind of vulnerability, so I hope you will give her a warm welcome. So come, let us worship together.
Let us now pause for a moment of deepening together as a community, for we each carry within us joys that are too great for one heart to hold, sorrows that are too much for one heart to endure, local and world events which call upon us to bear witness. Let us begin by recalling the joys, whatever you may be celebrating or whatever evokes a feeling of happiness or peace for you or for others. Now let us recall our concerns and sorrows, whatever you or the world may be holding that is in need of our healing and caring thoughts. In the heart of love and in the spirit of prayer, we give thanks for this time together, where joys can be magnified and sorrows can be lessened. Blessed be.
Please join with me in the spirit of prayer, a time of reflection, of centering, of deepening down, becoming fully present, not only to our own hearts, but to the larger heart in which we all reside. There's much which is heavy on our hearts, not the least those still trying to pull themselves out from the string of hurricanes, most particularly the people of Puerto Rico who have been devastated by Hurricane Irma. So much to be restored, so much suffering, so much feeling of impotence as we see the struggle and find so little we can do to help. So much beyond our control. And so we offer our imaginations and our effort to what we can do to help. And we offer our hearts, our attention, our love to those who are struggling to make it through. May they find the help they need. May we provide the help they need, the help they deserve. We lift up all of those who are struggling, all of those who have not yet gotten the help they deserve, all of those who are finding within themselves reserves of strength that they didn't know they had, that they didn't know they would need to have. Our hearts are with you. And we lift up our hearts in celebration. Celebration for those who will continue to have access to health care. Celebration for those who feel like the work they do makes a difference. Celebration for those who have rites of passage, who have new things, new babies, new ideas, new possibilities. And we celebrate that we are in all of this together. We celebrate that our hearts are joined, that we belong to a love that is larger than all of us, but in which each of us participates. We offer our hearts to this love. May we all be held in the heart of love.
Forgiveness is a life process. It can be many, many rounds of sensing that we have to turn our attention back to that place of vulnerability, back to that place of hurt. And often we need help with it. Especially if there's been trauma, we need the support of a healer or a therapist. But here's the thing. We can intend to forgive. And that opens the door, this heart's intention to let go of this armoring. So how do we do that? The process actually begins with self-compassion. When you feel like you have been injured by another person, rather than beginning by trying to forgive them, you start by bringing your awareness, your mindfulness, your kindness to the place of hurt inside you, to the place of fear. And it's in that gradual but powerful process of bringing your attention to your own hurt that the self-compassion will grow, and then you'll be able to look at the other person through the eyes of compassion. But it starts with compassion inward, with kindness inward, and then we begin to include others in our heart. There's a saying that vengeance is a lazy form of grief. If we stick with blaming, if we stay armored, if we continue to direct resentment outward, we never undergo that process of bringing a healing attention to the actual place that needs to be freed up. We get locked in. So, as part of this path of waking up, there's that intention to not push another out of our heart, even if we know that right now we're still angry, which is quite fine. It's part of our survival to be angry. But we know that ultimately we don't want to lock in to an angry heart. So you might just imagine for a moment some place in your life where you're holding on to resentment, where you've created distance with another person. And just for a moment ask yourself, who would I be if I let go of that resentment? What would my life be like if I no longer was living in that story of blame? In the moment of intending to forgive, to not push others out of our life, we begin to open into freedom.
Welcome to October at CLF. My name is Jessica Starr-Rockers, and I am the new Learning Fellow with CLF, and I am very happy to be here. Our theme this month is vulnerability, and it's a pretty good theme for me because this is my first homily with CLF, and I am feeling particularly vulnerable. I wanted to share this story with you about a time when I was vulnerable. One of the most vulnerable moments of my life, in fact, was almost 16 years ago when I got sober from alcohol and drugs. And my story of getting sober, there was a lot of ways that I got sober and stayed sober, and I used every tool in the toolbox. But I started by doing the 12 steps. And the fourth step is a fearless and searching moral inventory of ourselves. And I started with that as a key moment of vulnerability for me. And I went to my sponsor, and she asked me to write a list first of all the people that I was mad at, all the people that I had a resentment against. And my list was so long that it was actually a book. It was a book-sized list. And then in the second column of this list, she said to write down all of the stories that went with these resentments that I had. And then in the third column of the list, she told me to write down the emotion behind these stories. And then in the fourth column is when things got a little bit flipped around on me that I wasn't expecting. And she asked me to write down my part in these resentments, my part in these stories. And that took me a really long time to write down my part in things and really to get honest with myself and to tell the truth about my stories. A lot of my stories that I had been telling myself for a long time weren't entirely accurate. And so I had to investigate and be curious about my own stories, the stories I was telling myself about my life. And then came the really, really vulnerable part. If that wasn't bad enough, is step 5. And it is we admitted to ourselves, to God, and to another human being the exact nature of our wrongs. And so this meant that I went to my grand sponsor's house. This was my sponsor's sponsor. And I went there with my sponsor, and the three of us sat around in a circle while I read this book aloud to them, the book of all of the ways that I had contributed to the resentments that I had in my life. And I remember it was a very rainy day in February, and I'm in Seattle, so rainy days aren't that unusual, but this one was particularly cold and particularly gray, and I felt very anxious on the ride over to my grand sponsor's house. But when I got there, the chairs were in a circle, and there was tea and cookies, and I felt welcomed into a safe space. And I read my list aloud, and I waited for them to look at me with eyes of shame and judgment, and they never did. And afterwards, we all stood in a circle and held hands and prayed. And from that moment, I started to see myself and my stories a little bit differently. I started to tell the truth on myself, and the love and acceptance that my sponsors had for me made that flame of the divine inside of me that I feel we all have, that spark of love, grow a little bit. It was a little bit like the Grinch who stole Christmas, if you remember that, where his heart grew 3 sizes that day. Well, the spark of the divine inside me grew a little bit that day, and has continued to grow as I continue to be honest with myself, vulnerable in safe spaces with people who love me, and that I continue to practice that every day as much as I can to the best of my ability. And one of the reasons that I tell you this story, well, there's a couple reasons. The first is that the world that we are in today, so often we hang on to stories that are not entirely true. So often we resist seeing the truth. We resist vulnerability. And Brené Brown, the researcher Brené Brown, that you will hear a lot of this month because she's an expert on vulnerability, she talks about the shame that is underneath that, and how when we face that shame and we tell the truth on ourselves and we are vulnerable with one another, that is the first step to change. And I wonder, I am curious about what would happen in our world, in our country, if we started to own our stories, and if we started to tell the truth about who we are. I am reminded of Standing Rock, when the Marines knelt before tribal elders and admitted to the atrocities that the American military had committed against the indigenous people. And they asked for forgiveness. They were vulnerable and seeking healing. But always we start with ourselves and getting vulnerable in our lives at home, with our families, with our loved ones. That's how we begin that practice of vulnerability. Investigating the stories we tell ourselves and telling the truth to ourselves, admitting to ourselves when we have done something wrong. The 12-step groups call it keeping our side of the street clean. And that's when you admit what part you have in things. And that's really the practice of vulnerability, admitting that to people around you, to people who love you, who can hold you in that space, reflect that love back to you, and make that little spark of the divine grow. And then you can in turn do that to other people. That is what my call to ministry is that moment in that room with my sponsors. The love that they gave me, the love and acceptance, is what I want to offer other people as well. And that is what I wish for you this week and this month as we continue to talk about vulnerability, that you nurture that divine spark inside of yourself, and that you make space for that in others as well. Amen, and blessed be.
We are building a new way.
And now we come to that time in our service when we extinguish the flames that we've lit for this special time set apart. But never do we extinguish the flame that burns eternal, the flame of love, the flame of our commitment to a just and caring world. If you carry that flame, please touch your heart and say to yourself, I carry the flame, and allow that flame to burn bright.
This little light of mine, I'm gonna let it shine. This little light of mine, I'm gonna let it shine. This little light of mine, I'm gonna let it shine. Let it shine, let it shine, let it shine. Everywhere I go, I'm gonna let it shine. Everywhere I go, I'm gonna let it shine. Everywhere I go, I'm gonna let it shine. Let it shine, let it shine, let it shine. This little light of mine, yeah, I'm gonna let it shine. Oh, this little light of mine, I'm gonna let it shine. Yeah, this little light of mine, I'm gonna let it shine. Let it shine, let it shine, let it shine. I got the light of peace and love, I'm gonna let it shine. Oh, I've got the light of peace and love, I'm gonna let it shine. Yeah, I've got the light of peace and love, I'm gonna let it shine. Let it shine, let it shine, let it shine. All in my home, I'm gonna let it shine. Yeah, all in my home, I'm gonna let it shine. All in my home, I'm gonna let it shine. Let it shine, let it shine, let it shine. I've got the light of freedom, I'm gonna let it shine. Oh, the light of freedom, I'm gonna let it shine. Yeah, I've got the light of freedom, I'm gonna let it shine. Let it shine, let it shine, let it shine. Shine, 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 shine. Shine, just let it shine. Yeah, shine, 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 shine. Shine, just let it shine. Yeah, shine, 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 shine. Shine, just let it shine. Let it shine, let it shine, let it shine. This little light of mine, I'm gonna let it shine. Yeah, this little light of mine, I'm gonna let it shine. Yeah, this little light of mine, I'm gonna let it shine. Let it shine.